Hi, again, my name is Bryant Hopkins. I'm from NYU Wagner, and this is going to look at special education in the United States, specifically federal policy that governs that, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was passed in 1975, as well as some evidence about if these services are working for students in the largest school district in the country, New York City. So just to set a picture of what the educational landscape was like for students with disabilities prior to the passage of IDEA. In the 1950s and prior to that, students with disabilities, I think it's more accurate to say that they were accommodated instead of educated. So at this time, as you can imagine, the testing procedures to identify disabilities as well as set up educational plans to help these students are not what it was like today. So this ultimately led to ineffective education for these students. And on top of that, schools often punted educating these students. And hundreds of thousands of students with the most severe disabilities were actually placed in state institutions instead of educated at the public schools that we all know of. After this, between 1950 and 1975, the federal government naturally took a piecemeal approach to fixing the problem. First, they started with helping with teacher training as well as administrator training by passing these few pieces of legislation. And that moved on to providing grant assistance to specific school districts that helped with the extra costs incurred to educate students with disabilities. This list is in no way exhaustive during this period, but it's a little bit of a highlight that leads into the main piece of legislation that was passed in 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was originally passed as the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, and through its reauthorizations over the last 40 years, it became known as this. And this piece of legislation is vastly different from what was before because it provides and it guarantees a free and appropriate public education for all students that are considered to have a disability. And this legislation also established a process for setting the programs and the type of special education that students would receive, as well as identified 13, well, in the version that we have now, it actually identifies 13 disabilities that are federally recognized, and that includes learning disability, speech impairment, other health impairment, emotional disturbance, as well as 8 other disabilities that are much lower incidence compared to these 4 other categories. And this legislation serves students from birth and through the age of 21. So these are kind of the governing principles within the legislation, and the first 3, zero reject, protection and evaluation, and free and appropriate public education, really go to and work together at identifying and setting up the plan that these students will receive. So like I said before, any student identified with a disability is guaranteed an education under the plan. They can't be turned down for that reason. There also sets up a way to identify and assess these students to see what type of resources they need in the educational setting. And again, it's a free and appropriate education, which means that the services and resources that they do receive, there would be no additional cost accrued to the parents of those students. It's all a responsibility of the school and the district to provide those resources. The last 3, least restrictive environment, procedural safeguards, as well as parental participation, kind of goes at the quality of the education that the student receives. First, least restrictive environment. This gets away from the practices before of institutionalizing students that have severe disabilities and makes sure that they're not only educated in public schools, but to the most extent possible with non-disabled peers. And for procedural safeguards, this is just ways that parents and educators, if they feel that the IEP plans that they've developed for these students aren't working, or if it's not being appropriately implemented by schools, that they have a resource to challenge that and make sure they get the services that they need. And again, parental participation, this is just to ensure that everyone in this process is included. So just to give a brief idea of how these students receive services, at each school there's a multidisciplinary team, MDT, which receives references about students that might need services. And that team first decides if the student is, if it needs an assessment at all, and then if it is, they go to the parents to seek permission for this process, because parents ultimately have the decision to either accept or turn down services. After that, if they feel that they do need evaluation, these MDT teams have to answer 2 questions. First, does the child have an IDEA recognized disability? And second, does the child require special education services? If the answer to both these questions is yes, this team now sets up an IEP team. And this is the group of individuals that actually sets the goals and the type of plan that each student is going to have to receive their education while they're in school. This is the list of members that are on these teams. And what they have to do in putting together this IEP document is they have to list the present levels of achievement for the student, what types of goals they hope for that student to meet over the next year, measurable goals, and how those goals will be measured over the next year, as well as what they determine to be the list of special education, as well as services that the child should be receiving over the next year. And these plans are reviewed annually to make sure to see that they're actually helping the student, that they're meeting their goals, and if it needs to be adjusted at any time in the future, as well as if they've met goals to the need that they don't need any more special education services in the future. So besides the fact that this legislation guarantees an education for all students with disabilities, why else should we care about this? So in the United States, the special education population is extremely large, and it's a financially demanding population within the public school system. The population is doubled between almost doubled between 1975 and 2015, and special education students disproportionately capture a larger percentage of all educational dollars spent in the United States compared to the percentage of the school population that they make up. And that further shows that the average per pupil cost of educating special education students is far higher than that of students that are general education students. So despite these resources, students receiving special education services still lag behind general education students in short and long-term runs of academic achievement, as well as other lifetime benchmarks that we can see. And I have a few graphs kind of just represent what I've just talked about. Here we can see the growth in the special education population over the last 40 years. It's about 3.7 million right after passage of IDEA, and now it sits at about 6.6 million, and that's 13% of the national public school population. And this is a representation of the per pupil spending. These studies looking at these are really demanding, and unfortunately the resources that we have are a little bit outdated. So the most recent one we have is from 1999-2000, and it shows that the per pupil spending ratio for special education students versus general education students is about 1.9. And then on top of this, outcomes are lagging behind general education students. So this is results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress for 4th and 8th graders in both reading and math. And as you can see, the percentage of general education students that are scoring above proficient is far greater than the number of special education students that are scoring above proficient. And for non-academic outcomes, this is kind of looks at the rates of chronic absenteeism among special education and general education students. So chronic absenteeism is defined as a student missing at least 10% of the school year. So in New York City, it's a 180-day school year. That's missing 18 days of school, at least 18 days of school. That doesn't sound like a lot. You can even go further, and that's only missing about 2 days of school a month. But over the course of the entire year, that adds up to be quite a bit. And as you can see, overall, special education students are at a higher risk of chronic absenteeism, as well as each grade span over this entire thing. So seeing that, and obviously the large population, they're expensive to educate, and their educational outcomes are lagging behind general education students. All of these things kind of push for research to see, are the services that we're providing really working for these students? And this is some work I'm doing with Amy Ellen Schwartz at Syracuse, my advisor, Leanna Stiefel, as well as Michael Gottfried here at UCSB. And we're looking at the effectiveness of special education services for students diagnosed with a learning disability in New York City. So, yes, so there's little policy research available to improve special education outcomes. For general education students, there's a large and growing literature about what is working, both in the effects of school-based interventions and other types of things. But the same research questions really haven't been asked for the special education population. And there's multiple reasons for that's happening. The special education population is a unique group of students. Within the population, students with different disabilities differ from each other. They differ because of the actual disabilities themselves, the educational services that they receive, as well as kind of just the type of education that they receive. And not only that, they differ between students that don't receive services. So when we do normal comparisons in education research, it's a little bit difficult just comparing the special education population to the general education population. And on top of that, there's been little data available for the special education population prior to the implementation of No Child Left Behind in 2001. Prior to that, it was not required for special education students to be tested in all places in the country. Some pockets have data, but generally across the entire country, it was just very few pieces were available. But in New York City now, we have a unique opportunity to kind of look at the effect of these services. And we can do that because the special education population in the city is extremely large. As you can see on the right, over 20% of the students in New York City receive some type of special education resource. That's on par with Boston. DC is a little bit less at about 15.5%, which is still above the national average. And then you have Chicago and Los Angeles past that. So as I said before, that even within the special education population, there's a lot of differences. So if we want to get a true effect of what's working with these services, we're going to focus on one group within the special education population, those students classified with a learning disability. And we're going to do that because this population is large. It's the largest subgroup by disability, and that's both in the United States as well as in New York City. On top of that, students classified with a learning disability have the lowest academic achievement among all special education students. And again, finally, that we're going to limit this to the one disability so that we can get a cleaner estimate of the actual impact of services. And what's going to be key to our estimation strategy is most students classified with a learning disability are classified after entry into school. So most are classified after they received school, and you can see that in the number of students at each grade level that are classified with each disability. So for learning disabled students, as they enter, you can see the number grows through 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and that's going to be the key things we're going to look for when we want to look at increases to achievement, because testing in New York City and the state as well only occurs in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and we want to be able to look at how these students are doing before as well as after they start to receive their services. So again, just going through what we're going to have in this paper, we're exploiting longitudinal data from New York City public schools to look at the effects of special education services on academic and non-academic outcomes. So we're going to be looking at the testing, math, and ELA, as well as the non-academic outcome, which is attendance. And we're doing this by identifying students that are classified after entry into the school system. So we can look at students that are classified after kindergarten to look at the effects on attendance, because we only need 2 time periods, so one in kindergarten and one after. And then for the testing, we need to look at students that are classified after 3rd grade. And we need them to attend the public school for at least 2 years, and as well as participating in the testing for at least 2 years, so again, so we can see them on both sides. And we're considering these causal treatment effects with intent to treat effects, because we're using school and student fixed effects, which helps with that difference like I talked about before. And we're also controlling for differences across demographic characteristics. And I'm going to do a subgroup analysis later that we look across gender, race, as well as eligibility to receive free and reduced price lunch, as well as English language learner services. Just a preview of results. Our estimates suggest that special education services improve academic outcomes for students with a learning disability. However, there is no impact on attendance. And when we look at the subgroup analysis, we see there's larger effects for females, students receiving ELL services, as well as those eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And compared to white students, there's larger effects for Hispanics and Asians, and we have mixed results for black students. And these results are also robust to alterations in our sample size, as well as the inclusion of a few other student level covariates that I'll talk about in a little bit. As I said before, there's a small amount of literature on the subject, specifically even looking at short-run academic outcomes for elementary and middle school students. So our study here is most similar to the second one, the Hanishek paper from 2002, although we're improving on it because their data was from 1994 to 1997, and as I said, prior to NCLB, there was no requirement for students receiving special education services to be tested. And their sample of all the students with a learning disability that they have, only about 30% are tested. And our sample is much different. For our analytic sample, about 97% in math and 96% in English, I think, are tested. So we have a much higher rate of retaining them. So again, the data I'm going to use is from the New York City Department of Education, and we're looking at academic years 05-06 through 2011-2012. And we're looking at a sample of students that were only diagnosed with a learning disability. So they were never classified with any other disability during this period, so we get a unique and kind of cohesive sample of students. And this equates to about 44,500 students when we're in our attendance analysis, as well as roughly 24,000 for each in the math and ELA analysis. And the data also includes demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, foreign board status, English proficiency, poverty status, as well as grade level attendance, both of the test scores, as well as the IDEA-defined disabilities and indicators for the school that they attend. So this is just a set of descriptive statistics for the entire elementary and middle school population in New York City in 2006. So if you think about it, I can divide that sample into two distinct groups. First, students that were never classified with a disability between 2006 and 2012, and the group that were classified for at least 1 year with any type of disability. And that first one, the ones that were never classified, are on the leftmost column, and those classified with any type of disability are on the second column. And we can see students classified with a disability are disproportionately Hispanic, Black, native-born, receiving free or reduced price lunch, as well as eligible to receive English language learner services. These students also have a lower rate of attendance and perform worse. So these last two lines that we have are Z-scores for both math and ELA. So each of these scores are normalized at each grade and year. So we can take all third graders in 1 year, and we can compare them based on where they are. So 0 is average for the school year, and anything above that would be your above average, and any negative number would mean you're below. So as you can see, these students that are ever classified with a disability perform below average. And then the final column we have gets a better look at what our analytic sample is and the group of students that we actually look at, the group of students that are ever classified with a learning disability. The disproportionality across race and gender is similar, as well as the other demographics. The attendance rate is slightly better for these students, but as you can see again, their academic achievement is well below all the other students. So this is the model we're going to be estimating. Y is the outcome of interest that we have. That's either going to be our math or ELA Z-scores or annual attendance. And the main variable interest that we're looking at is the SPED ITT indicator. So this is a binary indicator that equals 1 in the first year that a student receives special education services, equals 1 in all years after, and equals 0 in all years prior to receiving services. So this gives us a way to compare average achievement after students receive services to before. And then on top of that, we're going to include the vector of demographic characteristics, as well as grade, year, school, and student fixed effects. So this kind of just gives you an idea of what the data looks like. This is 3 different students across all 6 years that we can observe in those grades, and the SPED indicator shows which years the student received special education services. So if equals 1, they received them, 0, they didn't. So we can see that all 3 of these students are going to be used in the analysis for attendance because they were all classified for the first time after kindergarten. But only the first 2 students are going to be used in the analysis for the math and ELA outcomes because the third student was classified for the first time in 3rd grade, and we can't observe them before and after receiving services. And then on top of that, we're going to go down one more level and look at specific effects and if they differentiate across the grade that you were classified. So we can see if being classified earlier is better than being classified later. And these are our main results. For the main outcomes, we can see that students perform almost 0.12 standard deviations better in math after receiving services and 0.1 standard deviations after receiving services in ELA. But we don't see any significant outcomes for attendance results. Then, when we look at the differences across when these students were classified, we see that students classified in 4th grade have higher outcomes compared to those classified in 5th, 6th, or 7th grade. And this holds across math and ELA outcomes, and you can see the differences for attendance there. But again, once we saw that before, once they're averaged out, there's no significant effects. So we're going to take this one step further, and I'm going to pull out the effects for each specific year that these students receive services. So for the first grouping, you can see that's not tan in the top. those are all the students that were classified in the 4th grade. I'm going to pick out specific effects for each year after they were first classified. So I can look at the effect in 4th grade, their 5th grade effect, 6th, 7th, and so on. And we can do this for each of the groups. So the thing to note here is that we see a peak, that after they're classified, they do better in each year, but then that improvement increases the number of years that passes since they were first classified. And it does tail off, but that's just kind of the trajectory that you'll see. So after this, we kind of want to show that these results are credibly causal. First, you can think that after a student starts receiving services or after they've come into school, if they don't perform well at the beginning, they're going to get more used to school, and you'll just see a natural progression of improvement as they're going throughout their school year. So it doesn't matter where we kind of set this cut to compare after versus before they get their services, you're always going to see a positive effect. So if that assumption was true, we could randomly assign the year that these students first received services, and we should be getting kind of a similar outlook to what we saw before, at least significance-wise. We may not get magnitude, but it should be the same. But when we do that, we get no significance in any of the effects here. So that shows that the timing of these resources really do matter, and that there is something behind that. These services are actually working, and that's what's helping out with these improvements. On top of that, you also might think that how a student's performing in school is really the driving force between them being identified for services, and that students that perform poorly, and if they're getting worse, those are the students that teachers or parents are going to be picking out and saying, these are the ones that need special education services, we need to help them. So what we wanted to do with this is kind of compare achievement in all of the years leading up to classification and see if there's any difference, see if there's a decline, see if there's improvement, and see what's going on. And if there was a decline, so all of these things that we see are compared directly to the year right before they're classified. So that's the thing, if you see a dip there, everything before should have a higher result. And all of these numbers that we have here are negative and insignificant. So that means that in all of the years leading up to classification, there's really no noticeable change in their achievement. It's going to be flatlined until they're classified. And then again, you can see the improvement after the facts. We get at this at the same way by doing this. We're using the characteristics in the year prior to predict a student being classified with a learning disability in the next year. So for the first column, this is using students' characteristics in the 1st grade to predict classification in 2nd grade, and so on, characteristics in 2nd grade to predict the 3rd grade. And the biggest thing to look at here is on the bottom 2 lines. This is when we actually include the student's academic achievement, and that's what we were looking at before, is if they're doing poorly, is that kind of what's identifying them for services. We can see that these effects are significant, but how we interpret these is compared to a student at average. That's another student that's a full standard deviation above them in achievement. It only reduces their probability of being classified with a disability by 2 percentage points. So even that's a huge thing to cross for a whole standard deviation. So these percentages are not, not exactly the biggest things, even though they're all significant. And then again, kind of just to test how robust and sensitive these results are, we did a few alterations to the sample. We also included students that were classified with other disabilities, not just a learning disability, as well as exclude students that weren't continuously enrolled for 3 consecutive years in the district. And we didn't see any changes to the results. They're almost exactly the same. Then we also included a couple more covariates, mobility and retention, which provides indicators to show if a student was moving to a new school in the current year or if they were repeating a grade that they had already done. Again, once we include these, there's no changes to our results. And then this is just a look at the subgroup analysis. So how we interpret these results is this is the baseline for each of them. And to get the desired effect for the subgroup, you add these 2 things together. So students that receive services for English language learners actually receive an additional effect in math as well as ELA. And then students that are eligible for free or reduced price lunch also see an additional benefit for their math scores and in attendance as well, which we hadn't seen before. So students that don't receive free or reduced price lunch actually do worse in attendance after they're classified, but those that receive free or reduced price lunch do better and actually have better attendance after classification. And then we look at it by gender and race. Females see an additional benefit in math, but not in English. And compared to white students, black students perform below them in math. However, they do see a bump in attendance. Asian students in both math and ELA see more positive effects compared to white students. And Hispanic students see only an additional effect in ELA scores. And kind of just looking at what might be driving some of these changes in addition to the resources. So this looks at the types of services that each student receives. So these are called self-contained, or excuse me, special class, special education teacher support services, related services, and integrated co-teaching classrooms. So this is the most restrictive environment. This is when students are pretty much put in an entire class all by themselves, compared to the other types of services which can either be provided in the classroom. Sometimes students are pulled out to receive additional services from teachers. And then in ICT classrooms, these are classrooms that have both a general education and a special education teacher working together to educate both populations of the students. And we can see that these are the places that most of these students are placed. So we kind of need to dig a little bit deeper to see how these are affecting them and if this is what's really driving it. So again, just to kind of recap what's happening, the effects that are receiving, it shows that the achievement gap between special education and general education students are closing by about 12 and 13% across the two different categories. The effect sizes are about 1.3 and 1.2, and this, using a little metric that we created, or at least kind of extrapolated from something else that was created, kind of equates to about 13 to 14 weeks of instruction by a teacher, which is a pretty sizable thing. And then implications for this, these results do indicate that there's a beneficial effect on achievement for the services that we see, but more analysis is necessary to investigate kind of the heterogeneity in teachers, schools, programs that these students are subjected to. And then there's also other things that are in their IEP. I said the different types of measurable goals that they're looking for. Academic achievement is just one of them. And again, this study doesn't focus on anything that, but it might be something interesting to look at in the future. And I believe that's it. Thank you.